His father held a candle near a timber brace in a Welsh mine drift and scraped frost from the beam with his thumbnail. Then he took the boy's hand and pressed it flat against the dry stone behind the brace. The rock was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was holding something, refusing to give it up. His father's breath fogged in the lamplight. "The earth does not warm you by kindness," he said. "It saves heat only when you stop the wind from stealing it." 30 years later, that hand pressed against clay at the bottom of a dead gulch in Colorado, and the ground was keeping the same secret. Morgan Pritchard had arrived in Eagle Fork 6 weeks before the land auction, and in those 6 weeks he had not slept indoors once. The mine at Malta Gulch had collapsed on a Tuesday in August. Morgan had been sent running for rope and iron wedges, while 2 men remained pinned behind a timber set that should have held but did not hold because the shoring had been ordered 3 inches thinner than any timberman would choose. He returned with help. The entry was sealed. They dug for 9 hours and pulled both men out alive. But the surviving superintendent needed someone to blame for the shoring he himself had approved, and a Welsh drainage hand with no family connections made an easy target. The rumor spread before the dust settled. Pritchard ran. Pritchard left men under rock. Pritchard saved himself. It was not true. But truth moves slower than gossip in mining country, and by the time Morgan walked into Eagle Fork with his canvas roll of tools, his cracked stove strapped to a borrowed mule, and his late sister's 11-year-old boy coughing beside him, the story had already arrived. Ellis Dower had been Morgan's charge since his sister Catherine died of typhus in Buena Vista the previous spring. The boy was slight, dark-haired, quiet in the way children become when they have learned that adults leave. His cough had started in September, a dry bark that worsened at night and eased by mid-morning. Morgan had no money for a doctor. He had no money for much of anything. What he had counted exactly: $5 in mixed coin, 32 pounds of flour in a sack with a mended seam, 9 pounds of beans, 6 pounds of salt pork wrapped in cloth and already showing an edge of yellow, 1 wool blanket, 1 canvas tarp, 1 set of mining tools, a pick, a hand drill, a pry bar, 2 timber dogs, and a mallet with a split handle he had bound with wire. The cracked stove. The borrowed mule he would have to return before the first snow or pay $1 he did not have. He could not go east. The rail fare from Leadville to Denver alone was more than he possessed, and from Denver to anywhere Catherine's people might have taken him in was another fare on top of that. He could not work underground. Every mine office between Malta Gulch and Leadville had heard the superintendent's version. He could not leave Ellis, and he could not feed Ellis, and the nights were already cold enough that the boy slept curled against the mule for warmth. Eagle Fork held a land auction on the first Saturday of October. The town was not Leadville itself, but a settlement 3 miles down the valley, close enough to share its supply chain and far enough to have its own small economy of timber cutters, teamsters, a boarding house, a store, and a scattering of claims that had never produced enough silver to justify the digging. The auction was meant to clear tax-defaulted parcels and abandoned lots. Men with money bought timber frontage. Men with less money bought meadow parcels near water. Men with almost no money bought the rocky cuts above the creek. Morgan had $5. He sat on a nail keg at the back of the meeting room above Rusk's store and watched every useful parcel sell before his name was worth calling. The room smelled of wet wool and coal smoke. Boot mud had dried white on the plank floor. A draft pushed through the window frames hard enough to rattle the glass every time the wind gusted, and each gust carried the sound of someone's horse stamping in the street below. Captain Wallace Greer stood at the front table with the deed papers spread before him, his silver watch chain catching lamplight each time he leaned forward to mark a sale. Greer was 61, a former freighter who had hauled goods over Mosquito Pass before the railroad made his wagons obsolete. He had reinvented himself as the town trustee, the man who kept the books, settled disputes over lot lines, and decided who received winter credit at Rusk's store. He was not unkind. He was precise. And precision in Eagle Fork meant knowing exactly who could survive and who could not. By the time the useful lots were gone, only one parcel remained on the table. Greer picked up the deed and held it between two fingers as if it smelled. Dead Gulch, he said. South slope below the ridge. 12 acres on paper. Half of that is vertical. Floods in spring, holds frost by September, and the only flat ground is the bottom of an erosion cut you could not plow with a mule team and a prayer. He looked out at the room. Starting bid is $5. Do I hear 5? Silence. Two miners near the stove exchanged a look. A freight boy leaned against the wall and picked at a hangnail. Morgan raised his hand. Greer studied him. Pritchard, you understand this is not a mining claim. There is no mineral on it. There is no timber worth cutting. There is no water except snowmelt that turns the bottom to soup for 6 weeks and then disappears. I understand, Morgan said. You have $5. I do. Greer set the deed on the table and tapped it with one finger. For $5, you can own the ditch nobody could die poor enough to want. Laughter. Not cruel laughter, not exactly. The laughter of men who had survived enough winters to know what $5 bought in October and what it could not buy in January. The freight boy grinned. One of the miners shook his head. In the doorway, a woman Morgan had not noticed, tall, thin-faced, her apron still dusted with flour, watched without expression. This was Nora Whitcomb, though Morgan did not learn her name until later. Morgan signed the deed. Greer blotted it, slid it across the table, and said, quietly enough that only Morgan and the men nearest the front could hear, a small cabin needs 6 to 8 cords of wood to hold through winter, or steady coal delivery from the train. You have no cabin. You have no wood supply. You have no coal account. You have a cracked stove, a boy with a cough, and a ditch. I am not trying to shame you, Pritchard. I am trying to tell you what the math says. Morgan folded the deed into his coat. I hear you, Captain. The math says you freeze, Greer said. That is not opinion. That is arithmetic. Morgan walked out into the October wind with the deed in his pocket and Ellis waiting by the mule. The boy looked up at him, and Morgan could see the question forming. The same question any 11-year-old would ask when the only adult in his life had just traded their last money for a piece of ground the whole town considered a grave. Come on, Morgan said. I want to show you something before dark. They walked south along the creek trail, past the last of the occupied cabins, past the timber line where stumps showed white against the hillside, past the point where the path narrowed and the ground began to tilt. The gulch opened below them like a wound in the slope, a deep eroded cut where spring runoff had carved away the softer soil and left exposed clay walls 15 feet high on the north side and a gentler slope on the south. The bottom was flat for perhaps 100 feet before the walls closed in again. Frost had already whitened the grass at the lowest point. Wind passed over the top of the cut in steady gusts, but inside the gulch, the air was still. Ellis coughed into his sleeve and said nothing. Morgan stood at the edge and looked down at the land he now owned. He could feel the cold rising from the bottom like water filling a bowl. Greer was right about one thing. Cold air settled here. It pooled in the gulch the way water pooled, and on a still night the temperature at the bottom would be 5 or 10 degrees colder than the ridge above. But Morgan had spent 12 years underground. He had worked drifts where the air at the entrance could freeze spit, and the air at the face, 200 feet in, stayed the same temperature winter and summer. He had pressed his palm against mine walls and felt the steady, indifferent warmth of rock that did not care what the sky was doing. He knew, not as theory, not as hope, but as the knowledge that comes from putting your hand on stone 10,000 times, that earth held heat the way a miser held coin. Slowly, grudgingly, but it held. The question was whether holding was enough. He had no answer yet. What he had was a dead gulch, a dying season, and a boy who needed to be warm before the snow came. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived in pieces over 3 cold mornings, and each piece came because Morgan could not stop looking at the gulch. On the first morning, he climbed down before dawn and stood in the dark at the bottom. The frost was heavy. His breath hung in the still air. But when he pressed his palm flat against the exposed clay of the north wall, the wall that never saw sun, the surface was cold but not frozen. 2 inches in, where he could push his thumb into the clay, the temperature did not change. The earth behind the wall was holding steady at something above freezing, even while the air in the gulch sat below it. He stood there with his hand against the clay until his fingers ached. And what he felt was not warmth. It was resistance. The ground was not giving heat. It was refusing to surrender it. On the second morning, he watched the sun. It came over the eastern ridge and hit the south wall of the gulch at an angle so low the light crawled down the clay face like poured honey. By mid-morning, the south wall was warm to the touch. The north wall, in shadow, was not. But the air between them had shifted. The frost at the bottom had melted. The gulch was a bowl, and the sun was filling it from one side. On the third morning, he brought a flat piece of broken glass he had found near an abandoned shaft house. He leaned it against the south wall, at the angle the sun had taken, and watched. The light passed through the glass and hit the clay behind it. He held his hand in the space between glass and wall. The air there was warm, not comfortable, not safe, but warm in a way the open air was not. He sat on a rock and thought about mines. A mine drift stays the same temperature because it is buried. The rock around it absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, and the deeper you go, the less the surface weather matters. A root cellar works the same way. So does a cave. The principle was not mysterious. It was simple. Earth is slow. Air is fast. Wind is fastest of all. If you could slow the air down, trap it, hold it, keep the wind from touching it, then the earth's slow warmth became enough to matter. What if the gulch was not a ditch? What if it was a drift? He pulled a flattened flour sack from his coat and began scratching lines with a charcoal stub. Not a cabin on top of the gulch, a structure inside it. Deepen the bottom by 4 feet. Line the walls with fieldstone to hold the clay in place. Brace the roof with log rafters the way he would brace a mine ceiling, heavy, tight, load-bearing. Cover the top with sod for insulation, but leave the south-facing slope open and glaze it with salvaged window glass, angled to catch the low winter sun. Behind the glass, darken the back wall with site and packed stone so it would absorb heat during the day and release it after sunset. Set water barrels where the sun struck them hardest. Below the growing beds, bury layers of fresh horse manure and straw. Hotbeds. The same method market gardeners had used for a century to force early vegetables. The manure would decompose and generate heat from below, while the sun heated from above and the earth held steady on all sides. It was not one idea. It was 6 ideas pressed together. Mine timbering, root cellar storage, cold frame gardening, hotbed forcing, greenhouse glazing, and the simple physics of thermal mass. None of them were new. What was new was building all of them into a single structure 9 feet underground in a gulch that everyone in Eagle Fork considered worthless. The risk was absolute. If he spent the autumn digging instead of earning wages, He would have no money, no credit, and no visible shelter by first snow. If the trench flooded, collapsed, or simply failed to hold warmth, he and Ellis would die underground instead of above ground, and the only difference would be that the town would have to dig them out. Morgan looked at the charcoal lines on the flour sack. He looked at Ellis, who was sitting on a rock with his coat pulled over his knees, watching a magpie strip something dead on the far bank. There was no second option. He could not afford wood. He could not afford coal. He could not build a cabin alone in the weeks remaining. He could not leave, and he could not stay above ground. He could dig. That was the one thing he could do as well as any man in the territory. 12 years of mine work had made him strong in the specific way that digging makes a person strong. Not the broad strength of a field worker, but the compact, enduring strength of a man who swings a pick in a space too small to swing it fully, hour after hour, in bad air, for wages that barely covered the candles he burned. He folded the flour sack and put it in his coat. "Ellis," he said, "we are going to build something. I need you to not ask questions until I can show you what it is." Ellis looked at him. "Is it a house?" "It is better than a house," Morgan said, though he was not sure this was true. "It is a place the wind cannot find." The digging began the next day, and with it the watching. Eagle Fork was small enough that a man's business was every man's business, and Morgan Pritchard's business, a disgraced miner with $5 and a sick boy digging downward into a worthless gulch, was the most entertaining business the town had seen since a freight driver lost a wheel on the creek bridge in July. The first men to stop and watch were a pair of timber haulers whose route passed above the gulch on the ridge road. They slowed their wagon, looked down at Morgan swinging a pick at the bottom of the cut, and one of them said to the other, loud enough to carry, "He bought a ditch and started digging downward." The phrase traveled. By the end of the week, it had reached Rusk's store, where Bartholomew Rusk repeated it to every customer who came through his door. Rusk was 46, thick through the chest, with a shopkeeper's soft hands and a speculator's sharp eye. He had come to Eagle Fork not to mine, but to sell to miners, and he had discovered that the real profit in a mining district was not in silver, but in flour, nails, tobacco, coal oil, and credit. Rusk extended credit the way a spider extends silk, carefully, patiently, and always with a design. When a man could not pay, Rusk took his claim, his tools, or his labor. He had acquired 6 properties this way, and he had his eye on a 7th. Dead Gulch was worthless to most men, but Rusk understood that worthless land beside a growing town had a way of becoming worth something when the town needed room to expand. He had planned to buy it himself at auction for the minimum bid. Morgan Pritchard had taken it first. Rusk did not forgive this, but he was patient about his resentments. The confrontation came when Morgan walked into Rusk's store to buy bent nails and broken window sash. The store was warm, lit by 2 oil lamps, and stacked to the ceiling with the inventory of frontier survival: flour barrels, nail kegs, rope coils, lantern glass, axe handles, canned goods with labels turning brown, and in the back, leaning against the wall like captured prisoners, a row of window sashes salvaged from abandoned mine offices. Morgan set his coins on the counter. "I need 2 pounds of bent nails and whatever cracked sash you have." Rusk looked at the coins, then at Morgan. "Glasses for houses, Pritchard. You do not have a house." "I have a structure that needs glass." "You have a hole in the ground." Rusk pushed the coins back across the counter. "I will sell you nails at 4 cents a pound and sash at 60 cents a pane. That is double what I charge men with standing accounts." Morgan's jaw tightened. The regular price for bent nails was 2 cents a pound. Sash salvage ran 20 to 30 cents depending on condition. Rusk was not refusing to sell. He was pricing Morgan out. "I will work for it," Morgan said. "Half a day's labor for 2 panes and a pound of nails." Rusk smiled the way a man smiles when the negotiation has gone exactly where he wanted it. "The only labor I need is someone to haul split wood for men who can pay their accounts. You want to spend your digging time hauling wood for me, I will consider it." The trap was clean. If Morgan hauled wood for Rusk, he lost digging days he could not afford. If he refused, he had no glass. Either way, Rusk won time, and time was the weapon Rusk understood best. Every week Morgan spent without shelter was a week closer to the moment when the Gulch would become too dangerous to occupy, and Morgan would have to sell it back for whatever Rusk offered. Morgan took his coins off the counter and walked out. Nora Whitcomb had been in the store, buying salt. She had heard the entire exchange. She said nothing to Morgan, but that evening Ellis found a wrapped heel of bread and 2 candle stubs sitting on the rock where they slept. And when Morgan asked who had left them, Ellis said, "The woman with flour on her apron." Morgan returned to the Gulch at dusk and swung his pick until the light failed. He was learning the ground. The top layer was loose soil and gravel, easy to move. Below that, a band of dense clay that rang when the pick struck it and came away in heavy slabs he could stack along the walls. Below the clay, broken rock mixed with sand and seepage. The seepage was the problem. Every foot he deepened, the water rose. Not flooding, not yet, but a steady weeping through the subsoil that turned the floor to mud and made the clay walls slick. He cut a drain trench along the low side, angling it toward a gravel pocket he had found at the Gulch's eastern end. He lined the trench bottom with broken stone, covered it with brush, and packed clay over the top. It was crude, but the water followed the path he had given it, and by the 3rd day the floor was firm enough to stand on without sinking. The pickwork was brutal. 8 hours produced roughly 4 feet of lengthened trench, 2 feet deep. At that rate, the 96 feet he needed would take weeks he might not have. His hands blistered, broke, calloused, and blistered again over the calluses. His shoulders ached in a way that was different from mine work. Mine work was confined, repetitive, specific. This was open digging, full swing, and his body had to relearn the rhythm. Ellis helped where he could. The boy carried stone, sorted flat pieces for wall lining, and fetched water from the creek. His cough worsened in the morning cold, but eased when he worked. Morgan watched him and calculated. If the first real snow came by late October, they had perhaps 3 weeks to get enough of the trench roofed and walled to survive inside it. 3 weeks to dig, line, brace, and glaze a structure that a crew of 4 men would need a month to finish. He dug faster. He ate less. He skipped the midday rest that mine workers took as a matter of survival and pushed through the hours when the sun was highest and the south wall of the Gulch radiated just enough warmth to keep his muscles from seizing. The first progress marker came at the end of the first week. 30 feet of trench deepened to working depth, the drain system holding, and the first course of stone laid along the north wall. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. But it was something that had not existed 7 days before. And when Morgan stood at the bottom and looked at the straight line of stone disappearing into the dusk, he felt the thing that had kept him alive in 12 years of mine work. The simple, stupid satisfaction of having moved earth from where it was to where it was not. On the 10th day, the weather turned. Not snow, not yet, but a cold rain that came sideways off the ridge and filled the Gulch with a sound like gravel hitting tin. The drain trench overflowed within an hour. Morgan stood in knee-deep water and watched 2 days of wall work shift as the clay behind the stone expanded with moisture. A section of the north wall slumped, dumping 40 pounds of fitted stone into the mud. Ellis watched from the rim, coughing. Morgan waded to the collapsed section, pulled the stones out one by one, and began refitting them with mud still running between his boots. The cold was deep enough that his fingers stopped working properly, and he had to stop twice to press his hands against his stomach under his coat until the feeling returned. He worked until dark. The rain did not stop. The wall held on the second fitting because he packed gravel behind the stone before laying it, giving the water somewhere to go that was not through his wall. It was a lesson the mine had taught him years ago. You do not fight water, you give it a path. But he had needed the failure to remember it. That night he and Ellis sheltered under the canvas tarp, stretched between two rocks at the gulch rim. The rain drummed against the canvas. Ellis slept pressed against Morgan's side, his breathing shallow and quick. Morgan lay awake and stared at the dark, and did the arithmetic again. 3 weeks to first snow, 30 feet dug, 66 remaining. 1 worker, 1 boy. No glass yet, no roof timbers yet, no help coming. If you have ever been told the numbers do not work, that what you are building cannot be built with what you have, tell us in the comments. Because Morgan Pritchard heard that math every day, and he was not finished calculating. The rain broke at dawn. Morgan climbed down into the gulch before the sun cleared the ridge. The drain had held through the night. The repaired wall had held. The floor was mud, but it was draining mud, and by mid-morning it was firm enough to swing a pick on. He adjusted his plan. The full 96 feet could wait. What he needed first was a section large enough to shelter 2 people and a stove, 20 feet of roofed, walled, insulated trench with at least 1 glass pane facing south. He could expand through the winter if the core section held. He could not expand if he and Ellis were dead. 20 feet. He could do 20 feet. He swung the pick, and the clay rang like a bell with a cracked lip, and the sound echoed off the gulch walls and rose into the thin Colorado air where nobody heard it except a magpie on the rim and a boy with a cough who was already carrying the next stone. The mentor arrived the way most important people arrive, without announcement at an inconvenient time, saying something Morgan did not want to hear. It was mid-October. Morgan had deepened and walled 38 feet of trench. The first 20 feet had a rough roof of salvaged logs laid across the top and covered with brush and sod. He had no glass yet. The south-facing slope above the roofed section was open to the sky, covered at night with the canvas tarp and weighted with stones. It was not a greenhouse. It was not even a shelter, properly speaking. It was a hole in the ground with a lid on it and a cracked stove venting through a gap in the sod. But the stove worked. At night, with the canvas pulled tight and the stove fed even a quarter load of scrap wood, the temperature inside the roofed section held above freezing, while the air at the gulch rim dropped into the 20s. The earth walls were doing what Morgan had hoped, holding heat the way stone holds heat in a mine drift, slowly and grudgingly, giving it back after the stove died down. Ellis slept on a shelf Morgan had cut into the north wall, wrapped in the wool blanket with his feet toward the stove, and his cough, while not gone, was no worse. Morgan was spacing fieldstone along the south wall of the unroofed section, fitting flat pieces into the clay to create a dark surface that would absorb sunlight once he had glass to trap it. When a woman's voice came from the rim above him. "You brace like a miner. Plants do not care how brave your roof is if their feet drown." He looked up. She was standing at the edge of the gulch with a sack over one shoulder and a wooden bucket in her other hand. She was 59 or 60, heavy through the shoulders with gray hair pulled back under a cloth and hands that were cracked and dark at the knuckles in the way of someone who had spent decades working in soil. Her name was Adeline Voss, and she had come to gather bones and ash from the dump pile at the Gulch's western end, where Eagle Fork's refuse collected in a shallow depression. Bones and ash for soil, she said, when Morgan asked what she wanted with garbage. Calcium and potash. If you mean to grow anything down there, you will need both, and you will need them before the ground freezes, or you will spend spring waiting for amendments to break down when you should be planting. Morgan set down his stone. I have not said I mean to grow anything. Adeline looked at the south wall he had been fitting with dark stone. She looked at the angle of the clay bank above it. She looked at the spacing of the log rafters on the roofed section. You're building a growing trench, she said. I have seen them. Not this deep and not this ambitious, but I've seen them. The angle is wrong. The angle is for winter sun. The angle is for winter sun if you are in St. Louis. You are at 10,000 feet. The sun is lower here and the season is shorter. You need the glass steeper or you will lose 2 hours of collection on either end of the day. She shifted the sack on her shoulder. Also, your drainage is going to fail. This was how Morgan met the woman who would teach him everything he did not know. Adeline Voss was a German-American widow who had worked market gardens outside St. Louis for 11 years before her husband, a carpenter, moved them to Denver in search of railroad construction wages. He died of a burst appendix in 1879. Adeline stayed in Denver and kept hothouse fires for a hotel conservatory, tending glass-walled growing rooms where wealthy guests expected fresh flowers in January and lettuce in March. She understood heat, glass, soil, and the behavior of plants under artificial season conditions in a way that Morgan, for all his knowledge of earth and stone, did not. She had come to Eagle Fork following a niece who had married a claim worker. The niece was dead now, carried off by the same influenza that moved through mining camps like a slow fire. And Adeline stayed because she had nowhere else that wanted her, and because the high mountain soil interested her in the way difficult problems interest people who have solved easier ones. She did not offer to help Morgan, not that first day. What she did was pour a bucket of water against the upper wall of his unfinished section and make him watch where it traveled. The water sheeted down the clay face, pooled at the base of the stone lining, and seeped through a gap Morgan had filled with gravel. Within 2 minutes, a dark stain appeared on the floor of the trench 3 feet from where Ellis was sitting. That is snow melt in December, Adeline said. That is spring runoff in April. That is every rain between now and then. Your drain trench handles the floor. It does not handle the walls. The water comes through the stone where you packed gravel, and gravel is a road for water, not a wall. Morgan stared at the seepage stain. She was right. He had built a drain for the floor, but not for the walls, and the walls were where the water would enter hardest once snow sat on the ground above. Clay packed behind the stone, Adeline said. Not gravel. Clay, pounded wet, then allowed to dry before you face it. It will not stop all of it, but it will slow it enough that your floor drain can handle the rest. She paused. You know mining. You do not know water and soil. They are not the same thing. I know, Morgan said. Good. Knowing what you do not know is the only part of this that requires intelligence. The rest is labor. She picked up her bucket and her sack of bones. I will come back tomorrow. Your hotbed plan will fail without proper layering, and if you kill seedlings with raw manure heat before winter begins, you will have wasted the only growing season you have left. She climbed back up to the rim and walked toward the dump pile without looking back. Morgan watched her go. He did not want help. He did not trust help, not in Eagle Fork, where help came with strings, and strings came with Rusk's name attached. But Adeline had not offered help. She had offered information, delivered as correction, and she had not asked for anything in return. She came back the next day, as promised, and the day after that. What Adeline taught, She taught by making Morgan do it wrong first, and then showing him why. The hotbed lesson came on the third day. Morgan had planned to fill the growing beds with fresh horse manure from the livery, cover it with soil, and plant directly. Adeline made him build a small test bed first, 2 feet square, layered with manure he had collected that morning. "Put your hand in," she said, after the bed had sat for 6 hours. Morgan pushed his hand into the soil. The heat was immediate and startling, not gentle warmth, but an aggressive, almost scalding pulse that rose through the manure layer like a living thing. "That will cook seed," Adeline said. "Raw manure generates heat for 10 to 14 days at temperatures that will kill any root that touches it. You do not plant into fresh manure, you layer. 6 inches of manure, then straw, then old leaves or sawdust if you can find it, then 6 inches of soil. The heat rises through the layers and reaches the roots at a temperature that warms without burning. If you skip the layers, you will have a hot grave for every seed you own." She made him disassemble the test bed and rebuild it with proper layering. Then she made him build a second one beside it with the manure packed too tightly so he could feel the difference in heat output the following morning. The loose-packed bed ran warm. The tight-packed bed ran hot enough that Morgan pulled his hand out after 3 seconds. "Manure needs air," Adeline said. "Pack it like a miner packs rubble, and it heats too fast and burns too short. Lay it loose, and it heats slowly and lasts through the weeks you need it." In return, Morgan showed her how to set a timber brace so it would bear the weight of wet sod without shifting. Adeline had spent her career working inside structures other people built. She had never framed a roof or shored a wall. When Morgan demonstrated the angle at which a log rafter transfers its load into a stone wall, not straight down, but slightly inward so the weight presses the joint tighter instead of spreading it, she nodded once and said, "That is elegant. Mine work teaches you something worth knowing." Their partnership was not charity, and it was not friendship, not yet. It was the recognition between two people who each held half of a necessary skill set that the other lacked. Morgan could build a structure underground that would not collapse. Adeline could make things grow inside that structure. Neither skill was sufficient alone. Together, they might be enough. The teaching continued in daily sessions that lasted an hour or two between Adeline's own work gathering soil amendments and Morgan's digging schedule. She taught him glass angle, pasar, how to prop a pane at the precise slant where winter sun entered at maximum intensity without creating a heat trap that could bake plants by noon on a clear day. She taught him venting, the critical difference between a greenhouse that breathed and a greenhouse that suffocated its own crop in moisture. She taught him which greens could tolerate cold soil and short light. Spinach, turnip greens, radishes, onion sets, cold-hardy cabbage starts. Morgan taught her drainage engineering, wall bracing, load calculation for roof spans, and how to read seepage patterns in clay. When Adeline wanted to cut a shelf into the north wall for seed storage, Morgan showed her how deep she could go before hitting the water table, and together they carved a row of niches that stayed dry because Morgan angled them slightly upward at the back, allowing any moisture to drain toward the face rather than pooling behind the seed packets. By late October, the trench had changed. 30 feet of the roofed section now had a properly drained floor, clay-packed walls, a functioning stove alcove, and a sleeping shelf where Ellis no longer coughed through the entire night. The next 40 feet were deep into working depth, with stone walls rising on both sides. And Morgan had acquired glass, not from Rusk. The glass came from 2 sources. Nora Whitcomb appeared one morning at the rim of the Gulch, carrying 2 old doors, and set them down without ceremony. My husband would have thrown them away only after pulling every hinge, she said, and left. The doors had glass panels, small, thick, wavy, but intact. Morgan cut the frames apart and salvaged 4 usable panes. The rest came from Adeline, who had spent 2 weeks trading bone meal and wood ash to women outside Leadville who had broken cold frames in their yards. She arrived one afternoon with 11 panes of varying sizes wrapped in straw inside a flour sack, and she handed them to Morgan as if they were nothing and said, "2 are cracked. Seal them with pitch and cloth, and they will hold 1 season. Do not waste them on the lower section where snow will press." By November, the numbers had changed. 48 feet of trench deepened and walled. 27 salvaged panes set in angled frames along the south slope, 12 of them cracked and sealed. 31 barrels collected from dump sites, cleaned and filled with creek water, positioned where sunlight through the glass would strike them. 4 food shelves cut into the north wall below frost reach. 2 growing beds built with layered hotbed foundations. 1 living alcove with the repaired stove, the sleeping shelf, Ellis's blanket, and a candle niche cut at head height so Morgan could read Adeline's seed labels after dark. It was not 96 feet. It was not finished. But it was alive in a way that the bare Gulch had not been, and when the first hard frost came in the second week of November, 2 weeks earlier than anyone expected, the trench held. Greer came to see it. He had not visited since the auction, but word had reached him that Pritchard's hole had glass on it now, and a trustee's duty included inspecting structures that might endanger the public. He climbed down the log steps Morgan had cut into the Gulch wall and stood in the trench with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression the careful blank of a man who did not want to admit surprise. The growing beds had spinach pushing through. Turnip green showed their first true leaves. Onion sets, planted in a cold frame within the trench, had rooted and were sending up green shoots. Radish tops ruffled along the edge of the warmer bed nearest the stove wall. The air inside the glassed section was cool, but not cold. Morgan's borrowed dairy thermometer hung from a roof brace, read 49 degrees in the shade and 56 under the glass where the sun struck the darkened stone. Greer touched the stone wall. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the growing beds. "A handful of leaves will not feed a town," he said. "I'm not feeding a town," Morgan said. "I'm feeding a boy." Greer studied him. "What happens when the snow buries your glass?" "I clear it." "And when it snows for 6 days and you cannot clear it?" Morgan had no answer for that. Not yet. He had roof-clearing poles, long saplings with flat boards lashed to the ends, and straw mats he could roll over the glass at night to hold warmth and shed snow. He had a small stove whose flue ran through a stone channel in the rear wall before venting outside, heating the masonry as it passed. He had water barrels that absorbed sun during the day and released warmth after dark. But Greer's question was the real question, and Adeline had already warned him of the same thing. The test was not cold. The trench could handle cold. The test was darkness. Snow that buried the glass for days would cut off the solar gain that drove the entire system. Without sun, the trench became a cellar, insulated above freezing, but not warm enough to keep plants alive and not warm enough to keep people comfortable without burning fuel he did not have in quantity. Greer left without saying the trench would fail. He also left without saying it would succeed. For Greer, that restraint was almost generosity. By late September, the surface world had already started to fail. Mountain gardens above 9,000 feet fought short-growing seasons, cold nights, and frost that arrived without the courtesy of a gradual decline. In Eagle Fork, the first killing frost blackened cabbage in open plots overnight. Bean plants collapsed into brown tangles. A man named Orchard, Matz, and the irony of his name was not lost on anyone, lost his entire potato crop to a frost heave that cracked the soil and exposed the tubers to air cold enough to split them. Rusk raised flour prices the following morning. The trains had not slowed yet. The pass was still open. But Rusk understood that fear was as good as scarcity for moving prices upward, and the sight of frozen gardens concentrated fear like a lens concentrates light. Inside the trench, Morgan recorded measurements with the borrowed dairy thermometer, marking numbers on a board with charcoal. Outside at dawn, 18 degrees. Trench air before sunrise near the door, 42. Trench air before sunrise near the stone wall, 49. Under the glass, after 1 hour of sun, 56. In the plant bay at midday on a clear day, 74. That last number was the one Adeline watched. "Vent it," she said, the first time the thermometer touched 70. She grabbed Morgan's arm hard enough that he stopped what he was doing. "Vent it now. 75 is the ceiling. Above that, you cook the leaves, and cooked leaves do not recover. Open the end panel, let cold air cross the bed for 10 minutes, then close it. Every clear day, every time it touches 70. If you forget once, you lose a planting." Morgan built a hinged vent at the far end of the glassed section, a wooden frame with oiled cloth that could be propped open with a stick. Every clear afternoon, when the sun drove the temperature upward, he opened the vent and let the mountain air cut through the warm bay for exactly the time Adeline prescribed. The plants survived. The system breathed. But the system was fragile in ways Morgan was only beginning to understand. The glass had to be clean. A film of condensation on the inside surface could cut light transmission by a third, and light was the currency the entire structure ran on. Every morning, before dawn, Adeline taught him to wipe the panes with a dry cloth, carefully because several were cracked and sealed, and rough handling could reopen a seal and let cold air pour through a gap no wider than a fingernail. The manure beds needed monitoring. As the manure decomposed, it settled, and the soil layer above it sank, exposing roots. Morgan added soil weekly, measuring the depth with a stick marked at 2-inch intervals, still another of Adeline's methods. The water barrels absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, exactly as planned, but the release was uneven. Barrels near the glass warmed first and cooled last. Barrels against the north wall barely warmed at all. Morgan rearranged them twice before finding a configuration that distributed nighttime warmth across the growing beds, without creating cold spots where frost could form on the soil surface even inside the trench. Each problem solved revealed the next problem. Each solution required another piece of knowledge Morgan did not have. And each day that passed moved them closer to the real test. Not October frost, not November cold, but the deep winter that sat above the mountains like a held breath, waiting. January came to Eagle Fork the way a door closes, slowly, then all at once. The storms began in the last week of December. Snow fell for 3 days, stopped for 1, and fell for 4 more. The pass above Leadville accumulated drifts that covered the rail line to a depth no plow could clear without a full crew, and the crew could not reach the pass because the road to the crew's camp was buried under a slide that had come down from the ridge above the switchback at 2 in the morning on New Year's Day. Then a second slide hit. This one buried a work camp, tents, tools, a cook shack, and 2 mule teams. 3 men were pulled out alive. The mules were not recovered. The Denver and Rio Grande's superintendent sent word that the line would reopen when conditions allowed, and not before. And conditions did not allow for the first 2 weeks of January and showed no sign of allowing for the third. Freight stopped. The last supply wagon to reach Eagle Fork had arrived on December 28th, carrying flour, coal oil, salt, and a half-load of coal that Rusk purchased in its entirety before the wagon driver could unhitch his team. Rusk tripled the price of flour overnight, He sold coal by the bucket at a rate that would have been criminal in a city with laws and laughable in a mining camp with none. Families that had planned their winter around regular deliveries found themselves rationing food they had expected to replenish in 2 weeks. The cold deepened. Morgan's borrowed thermometer, hung on a nail outside the trench entrance, read 14 degrees below zero on the morning of January 9th. By the 12th, it read 22 below. The air had a quality that Morgan remembered from underground, a stillness that felt like weight, as if the cold itself had mass and was pressing down on everything beneath it. Inside the trench, the system held, but it held the way a rope holds when the load is just under the breaking point, taut, vibrating, making sounds that told you it was working harder than it should. Snow covered half the glass. The south-facing panes, angled as they were, shed light powder well enough, but the heavy wet snow that came on January 10th clung to the glass and froze into a crust that no amount of wind would shift. Light transmission through the uncovered panes dropped. The growing beds, which had been producing under weak but sufficient sun, slowed. The spinach stopped growing. The turnip greens held barely, their leaves curling inward like fists. Ellis crawled through the narrow service passage Morgan had built between the living alcove and the glassed section, a space barely wide enough for a boy's shoulders, carrying a broom lashed to a pole. He pushed the broom head against the underside of the glass and scraped. Ice cracked and shifted. Snow slid down the outer surface in sheets. Light flooded through the cleared pane and hit the stone wall in the nearest water barrel, and Morgan watched the thermometer climb from 41 to 47 in 20 minutes. But Ellis could only clear from below, and the panes he could not reach from below had to be cleared from above. Morgan climbed out of the trench into whiteout conditions on the morning of January 13th and worked his way along the top of the glass section with a flat shovel, scraping snow from panes he could barely see. The wind at the rim was a living thing. It hit from the northwest with a force that knocked him sideways, and the snow it carried was not falling. It was traveling horizontally, stinging his face like thrown sand. He cleared 6 panes in 40 minutes. His hands stopped working after 30. He went back down and pressed them against the stone wall until the feeling returned, then climbed up and cleared 4 more. That night, a log rafter in the 40-foot section cracked. The sound was distinctive, a long, splitting pop that echoed down the length of the trench like a rifle shot fired in a canyon. Morgan was feeding the stove. He stopped. Ellis sat up on his shelf. The silence that followed the crack was worse than the sound itself, because in a mine, silence after a crack meant the timber was deciding whether to hold or let go. Morgan grabbed the candle and moved to the 40-foot section. The rafter, a lodgepole pine 12 inches through at the base, had split along a grain line 3 feet from the wall. The split had not opened fully. The rafter still bore weight, but the sod and snow load above it was pressing the split wider with each hour, and if the rafter gave way, the entire section of roof would drop into the trench and take the 2 best growing beds with it. He had a mine jack, a wooden screw press used to prop sagging timbers underground. He had carried it from Malta Gulch as part of his tool roll, and it had sat unused because none of the trench rafters had needed it. He braced the jack under the cracked rafter, screwed it tight until the split closed by a 1/4 inch, and wedged a flat stone between the jack head and the rafter base to spread the load. It held. The split stopped widening. But the jack was his only one, and there were 23 other rafters in the roofed section, and the snow was not done falling. The knock came at midnight on January 15th. Morgan heard it the way you hear sounds underground, first as a vibration through the walls, then as a rhythm that does not belong to the structure. Someone was knocking on the wooden hatch he had built over the trench entrance, not pounding, knocking, politely, steadily, the way a person knocks when they are ashamed of needing to knock at all. He opened the hatch. Nora Whitcomb stood in the snow with a child wrapped in a blanket pressed against her chest. Behind her, the dark was total. The wind had died, and in the stillness, the cold was so deep that Morgan could hear the trees on the ridge cracking, sharp reports, like breaking bones, as the sap inside them froze and expanded. "Clara Bell," Nora said. The child's name. Morgan could see the girl's face in the candlelight from below, 5 or 6 years old, flushed with fever, her breathing a thin whistle that did not sound like breathing at all. She is a boarder. Her father is in the mine at Ibex. She has been sick for 3 days. My room is not warm. I cannot. Nora stopped. She pressed her lips together. I'm not asking for food. I'm asking for warmth. Morgan stepped back from the hatch. Bring her down. Nora descended the log steps carefully, holding Clara against her shoulder. The girl's weight shifted as they came down, and Nora's foot slipped on the icy second step, and Morgan caught her arm and held it until she found the floor. The trench air was 46 degrees. It was not warm by any standard that mattered in a house, but it was 68 degrees warmer than the air Nora had walked through to get here, and when the still earth-scented air of the underground space closed around them, Clara Bell made a sound, a small, involuntary exhalation like a hand unclenching, and buried her face deeper into Nora's shoulder. Morgan cleared the sleeping shelf, layered the wool blanket and the canvas tarp on it, and Nora laid Clara down. The girl's breathing eased within the hour. Not healed, not better, but no longer the thin whistle. The warmth was not medicine, but it was the absence of the thing that was making the medicine impossible. Nora sat on the floor beside the shelf and did not move. How bad is it outside? Morgan asked. Nora looked at him. Her face in the candlelight was exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. The Hendricks cabin lost its stovepipe at dusk. Smoke filled the room. They went outside to clear it and could not get back in before the children started crying from the cold. They are in the Methodist cellar now, 7 people in a root cellar with no stove. How many know about this place? Nora was quiet for a moment. Everyone saw me leave. Morgan closed his eyes. He had built the trench for 2 people. He had stored food for 2 people rationed across 8 weeks. He had calculated heat retention, air volume, and fuel consumption for a space occupied by 1 man and 1 boy. Every additional body in the trench changed the arithmetic. More breath meant more moisture on the glass, more body heat, but also more oxygen consumed. More food needed from stores that were already thin. But Clara Bell was breathing on a shelf, and her breathing was better, and the sound of that breathing was the sound of the trench, doing what it was built to do. If you are still here, you already know this is not a story about a ditch. Stay with us, because in the next hours, that cracked rafter, that buried glass, and every person who laughed at Morgan Pritchard are about to converge in a place no bigger than a mine drift, and what happens inside will change this town. The next morning, Greer arrived. He came down the steps without knocking, carrying a man across his shoulders. The man was a rail worker, young, thin, his boots cut off because his feet had swollen inside them, and no one had a knife sharp enough to cut frozen leather without cutting skin. Greer laid him on the floor near the stove without asking permission, and said, He was walking from the work camp. He made it to the creek bridge. His feet are white. Morgan looked at the rail worker's feet. The skin was waxy and hard. He had seen frostbite in the mines, not from cold, but from men who stood in icy water for hours and did not notice the damage until they took their boots off. "Keep them away from the stove," Adeline said. She had arrived 20 minutes before Greer, appearing at the hatch with her coat buttoned wrong and her breath in clouds. "Warm them slowly, cloth wraps soaked in cool water first, then warmer water over hours. Direct heat will kill the tissue." She took over the rail worker's care with a competence that Morgan recognized, not a doctor's skill, but a gardener's understanding of damaged living things. You did not force recovery, you created conditions and waited. By noon on January 16th, the trench held 7 people: Morgan, Ellis, Nora, Clara Bell, the rail worker whose name was Deacons, Adeline, and a woman named Pell who arrived carrying nothing except her 2-year-old daughter and the information that her cabin roof had partially collapsed under snow weight. Morgan organized. It was what he knew. Underground, when a drift was failing, you did not debate. You assigned tasks, set watches, and managed resources with the precision of a man who understood that panic was more dangerous than the collapse itself. He set rules. Children and the sick ate first. Anyone who entered the trench worked. Snow clearing from the glass was a rotating duty, 2 hours on, 4 hours off, day and night. Condensation wiping happened at dawn and midday. The stove was fed in small loads to stretch the wood supply. No one touched the food shelves without Morgan's count. The food shelves held potatoes stored in sand, turnips packed in straw, dried beans in cloth sacks, onions strung on twine from the roof braces, carrots buried in damp sand, cabbage heads wrapped in newspaper, and trays of living greens, spinach, turnip tops, radish leaves, still growing under the glass despite the reduced light. It was enough for 3 people for 8 weeks. It was enough for 7 people for perhaps 3. Nora took over rationing. She counted every potato, weighed beans by the handful, and portioned meals with an accuracy that Morgan, who could estimate a timber span within a 1/4 inch, found slightly frightening. She assigned Adeline as cook for the simple reason that Adeline could make bean broth with turnip greens taste like something a person would choose to eat, rather than something they endured. Ellis measured candle marks to ration light. He scratched a mark on each candle at half-inch intervals and announced the time remaining with the seriousness of a boy who understood, without being told, that darkness was its own kind of cold. On the 17th, a man from the cabin nearest the ridge road died. His name was Paulson. He had clogged his stovepipe with green wood, and the smoke drove his wife and 3 children into the open at 4 in the morning. They went to the Methodist cellar. Paulson stayed to clear the pipe. They found him at dawn, sitting in his chair with the pipe wrench still in his hand. The stove had gone out. The door was open. He had either passed out from smoke or sat down to rest and frozen before he could stand again. The news came down the trench steps with Greer, who delivered it the way he delivered all information, flatly, precisely, without editorial. Morgan said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "How many are in the Methodist cellar now?" 11, Greer said. "No stove, 3 blankets. The Paulson children have no coats. Their coats were in the cabin, and the cabin is too cold to enter now." The trench could not hold 11 more people. The air volume would not support it. The food would not last. The heat balance, already strained with 7 bodies, the stove running low, and half the glass buried, would collapse if 20 people breathed and moved and needed warmth in a space built for 2. But the Paulson children had no coats, and the Methodist cellar had no stove, and January had not finished. Morgan looked at Adeline. She looked back at him with an expression he had seen on the faces of experienced miners when the timber started talking, not fear, but calculation. the rapid cold arithmetic of what could be done with what existed. "We bring the children," Adeline said. "The adults stay in the cellar. We send them hot water in the morning and cooked food at noon. It is not enough." "But it keeps them alive." Greer nodded once. Morgan opened the hatch. That night, the trench held 10 people. 3 of them were Paulson's children, ranging from 4 to 9 years old, still wearing the clothes they had fled in. Nora wrapped them in sacks and pieces of canvas and laid them on the floor near the stove, and the warmth, 48 degrees, no more, was enough that the youngest stopped shivering and slept. Outside, the temperature fell to 26 below zero. Inside the trench, the air near the rear stone wall held at 44 degrees. The water barrels had a skin of ice on top by dawn, but the water beneath was liquid. The food shelves remained above freezing. The greens in the growing beds had stopped growing, but they had not died. The trench held. It held not because it was warm, it held because it was not cold. The difference between 44 degrees and 26 below zero was 70 degrees, and those 70 degrees were the distance between a living child and a frozen one. The earth walls, the stone mass, the glass that caught whatever sun the clouds allowed, the water barrels that stored that sun's heat and released it grain by grain through the night, the manure beds that generated their slow warmth from below, the stove that burned its small ration of wood with the efficiency of a fire burning in a space where no wind could touch it. All of these together produced not comfort, but survival, and survival that January in Eagle Fork was the only thing that mattered. Russ came on the 19th. He did not knock. He pounded. Morgan opened the hatch to find Rusk standing in the snow with his coat collar turned up and his face red from cold and something else, a fury that had been building since October, since the day Morgan had outbid him for a worthless gulch, and then against every reasonable expectation made the worthless gulch into the only thing in Eagle Fork that worked. "You are hoarding food," Rusk said. "You have supplies in there that should be distributed through the store under town authority." "There is no town authority over a private shelter," Morgan said. "There is when people are dying. Greer can order." "Greer is inside," Morgan said. "He is warming a rail worker's feet. If you have a complaint, you can come down and make it." Rusk looked at the hatch. He looked at the steps leading down into the earth. He did not go down. Whether this was because he could not stand to see what Morgan had built, or because he could not stand to need it, Morgan did not know and did not ask. "This is not over, Pritchard," Rusk said. "No," Morgan said. "It is not." He closed the hatch. Inside, Greer looked at Morgan and said nothing. But his silence was different now. It was not the silence of a man withholding judgment. It was the silence of a man who had already made one. The trains did not come for another 9 days. During those 9 days, Morgan's trench fed hot food to 11 adults in the Methodist cellar, sheltered 10 people underground, kept 3 growing beds alive under glass, and lost not one life. When the first freight wagon reached Eagle Fork on January 28th, the driver found a town that had survived, but not a town that was the same. The Methodist cellar smelled of too many bodies and not enough air. Paulson's cabin stood open and frozen. Rusk's store was half empty and fully resented. And in Dead Gulch, a trench 96 feet long breathed steam from its vent on cold mornings, like a living animal sleeping underground. The morning after the freight wagon arrived, Greer came to the trench alone. It was early, non-ernin, before dawn, before the sun could touch the glass and start the slow warming cycle that Morgan had counted on every day for 3 months. The air outside sat at 11 below. The air inside the trench near the rear stone wall held at 43. Greer stood in the growing bay with his hands at his sides and looked at the wall the way a man looks at something he has been wrong about for a long time and is only now allowing himself to see clearly. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. He held it there. Morgan watched and said nothing. "I called this a grave," Greer said. His voice was quiet, not defeated. Greer was not a man who could be defeated, but corrected, adjusted. The voice of a man revising figures he'd been certain of. "I was wrong. It is a battery." Morgan shook his head. "It is a debt. Everyone inside owes labor." Greer turned and looked at him. In the candlelight, the old freighter's face was deeply lined. The skin around his eyes creased from decades of squinting against mountain sun and trail dust. He had spent his life calculating loads, what a mule team could pull over Mosquito Pass, what a wagon could bear on a frozen road, what a man could carry and still walk. He understood weight and capacity and the precise point at which a system fails. What he had not understood was that a hole in the ground could hold the same physics as a well-built wagon. "You brace this like a mine drift," Greer said. "I braced it like a mine drift because that is what it is," Morgan said. "Earth does not care what you call the space inside it. It holds heat, or it does not hold heat. The name is irrelevant." Greer withdrew his hand from the wall. He looked at the growing beds where spinach had begun to recover now that snow clearing had resumed and sunlight reached the darkened stone for 6 hours a day. He looked at the food shelves, reduced but not empty, where Nora's ration marks were scratched into the wood in rows so precise they looked like account entries. He looked at the sleeping shelf where Clara Bell lay with color in her face for the first time in 2 weeks. "How many could learn this?" Greer asked. "Anyone who can dig and follow instructions." "That is not what I am asking. I am asking how many you would teach." Morgan understood the question. Greer was not asking about capacity. He was asking about willingness, whether Morgan, who had been mocked, price gouged, and nearly condemned by this town, would share the knowledge that had saved it. "Anyone who brings labor," Morgan said. "I do not sell this. I do not trade it. I teach it to anyone who will dig." Greer nodded once, the way he nodded when a freight manifest tallied correctly. Then he climbed the steps and went out into the cold, and that afternoon Morgan saw him in front of Rusk's store, speaking to 3 men who had lost their surface cellars to the freeze. He was drawing lines in the snow with a stick. He was explaining something about depth and angle. He was doing it badly, but he was doing it. Nora's conversion was not a single moment. It was an accumulation. She had arrived at the trench as a woman asking for warmth for a sick child. She had stayed as a woman who organized rations, managed sleeping rotations, and enforced hygiene rules that Morgan would never have thought to create. She had watched the trench save Clara Bell, save the Paulson children, save the rail worker whose feet Adeline nursed back from the dead white of frostbite to the angry red of healing tissue. She had seen the growing beds produce food when every surface garden in Eagle Fork was frozen rubble. But Nora was the practical skeptic, and practical skeptics do not convert on evidence alone. They convert when they understand the mechanism well enough to trust it without the person who built it. Her conversion came on a Tuesday in February when Morgan was outside clearing snow from the upper panes, and Nora was alone in the growing bay. The vent had been closed overnight, and the morning sun, low and strong after 2 clear days, had driven the temperature in the plant bay up to 68 degrees. Nora stood in that warmth, surrounded by green things growing in the dead of winter, with frozen ground 6 feet above her head and 12 below air on the other side of the glass. And she understood. Not the physics. Morgan could explain the physics. She understood the choice. Morgan had chosen to go underground when every instinct and every neighbor said to build upward. He had chosen to work with the earth instead of against it. He had chosen to look at a worthless ditch and see not what it lacked but what it already had: depth, shelter from wind, thermal mass, and a south-facing slope that caught the only free heat source available. She touched the glass. It was cold on her fingertips. The outside surface always was, but the air between the glass and the stone wall was warm, and the stone itself held the faint residual heat of yesterday's sun, and the water barrel nearest the wall was cool but not cold, and the soil in the growing bed was 51 degrees at a depth of 4 inches, which was the temperature at which spinach roots are most active. She did not say anything to Morgan about this moment. But that evening she began asking questions. Not the skeptic's questions she had asked before, which were designed to find flaws, but a student's questions designed to understand. How deep does the drain need to be? How much pitch seals a cracked pane? How do you know when the manure is ready for planting? What happens if a rafter cracks and you have no jack? Morgan answered every question. Adeline, sitting on her barrel near the stove and mending a seed sack with thread she had pulled from her own hem, answered the ones Morgan could not. The community came to the trench in ones and twos, then in groups. A man named Falk, a timber hauler who had been one of the first to repeat Pritchard's grave with windows, came with his hat in his hands and asked whether he could see the growing beds. Morgan showed him. Falk stood in the plant bay for 4 minutes without speaking, then asked how deep the stone lining needed to be for a smaller version, say 10 feet long, built into a bank behind his cabin. Morgan told him. 2 feet of stone minimum, backed with packed clay, with a drain at the lowest point running to daylight. Glass angled at 35 to 40 degrees for the latitude. A hotbed at the base if he wanted to extend the season. A vent at the far end that he must open every clear day without fail. Falk left and returned 2 days later with measurements of his bank and a sketch that Morgan corrected in 3 places before handing it back. A woman named Torvald came with her daughter, 14, and asked to learn the seed starting method. Adeline taught them in the trench, kneeling beside the growing bed while the daughter took notes on the back of a feed bill. The lesson lasted an hour. When they left, Adeline said to Morgan, "That girl has better hands than you do. She will lose fewer seedlings." 3 families began digging small covered cold pits against south-facing banks before the snow had fully melted. They did not have enough glass for full trench houses, so Adeline showed them oiled cloth stretched over frames, not as efficient as glass, but enough to raise soil temperature by 10 or 15 degrees and extend the growing season by 3 weeks on either end. Measurable results circulated through Eagle Fork the way Rusk's prices had circulated, by word of mouth, at the store counter, over fences, above-ground cabins during the crisis, water buckets frozen solid, potatoes ruined in shallow sheds where ground frost broke through, coal nearly exhausted, 3 families in the Methodist cellar, 1 death. Morgan's trench during the same period. Air near the rear wall never dropped below 42 degrees. Root shelves held firm at temperatures between 38 and 44. Greens regrew after cutting. 1 stove load lasted through the night because no wind could strip the heat. 10 people sheltered and fed. No deaths. The numbers were not dramatic in the way a mine strike is dramatic. They were dramatic in the way that not dying is dramatic when the alternative was specific and close. Rusk watched the traffic to the trench and said little. He did not visit. He did not ask questions. What he did was calculate. Rusk was always calculating, not temperatures or soil depths, but margins. The trench threatened his margins because it made people less dependent on his store. If families could store food underground through winter, they bought less flour in January. If they could grow greens under glass, they needed fewer canned goods at 4 times the summer price. If they could shelter in earth-walled trenches, they burned less coal. Every success Morgan achieved was a line item Rusk lost. His first move was quiet. He offered to manage distribution of trench-grown produce through his store, taking a percentage for handling and sales. Morgan refused. His second move was louder. He told Greer the trench was an unsafe structure that should be inspected and placed under town authority for public safety. Greer, who had spent a night inside the trench and pressed his palm to the wall and used the word battery, looked at Rusk and said, "I have inspected it. The bracing meets any standard I would apply to a mine entry. If you have a specific structural concern, write it down and I will review it. Otherwise, I have business." Rusk did not write anything down, but he did not stop calculating. The weeks after the crisis were the weeks when Adeline and Morgan built something neither of them had planned. They had started as corrector and corrected. Adeline telling Morgan what he was doing wrong, Morgan fixing it. They had become collaborators during the construction, teaching each other their separate skills, building a system that neither could have built alone. But in February and March, with the crisis behind them and the trench stabilized, they became something closer to partners in a project that had grown beyond survival. Adeline wanted to prove that the trench could do more than keep people alive. She wanted it to produce. She began with seed saving. The spinach that had survived the crisis was allowed to bolt, to send up flower stalks that would eventually produce seed. Morgan wanted to cut it for food. Adeline stopped him. "You eat the plant, you eat once," she said. "You save the seed you eat for 10 years. I did not keep hothouse fires in Denver for 6 winters so you could eat next week's seed crop because you are hungry today." They argued. It was their first real disagreement, and it ran deeper than spinach. Morgan's instinct was survival. Use what you have now because tomorrow is not guaranteed. Adeline's instinct was cultivation. Invest now because tomorrow is the only thing that matters. The argument lasted 2 days and resolved when Adeline pulled out a tobacco tin she had been keeping in her coat and opened it on the barrel beside the stove. Inside were seeds. Dozens of small paper packets, each labeled in Adeline's tight German script, with a name, a date, and a planting note. Cabbage, Marchfield late, turnip, purple crown, spinach, winter broad, beet, long red, carrot, Chantenay short, onion, yellow Dutch. She had carried them from Denver. She had carried them through the niece's death, the move to Eagle Fork, the winter in a borrowed room. She had carried them because seeds were the one thing she understood to be worth carrying. "These are what I brought instead of money," she said. "Every one of them is tested. Every one of them will grow at this altitude if the soil is right and the season is managed. But seeds run out, Morgan. If we do not save from what we grow, the trench becomes a single season's trick. I did not build this with you, so it could be a trick." Morgan let the spinach bolt. Their partnership deepened through daily work that was no longer crisis-driven, but methodical. Adeline planned staggered plantings so that, as one crop finished, the next was ready. She showed Morgan how to read leaf color for nutrient deficiency. Yellowing at the edges meant potassium. Yellowing between the veins meant iron. Overall paleness meant nitrogen. She taught him to make compost tea from the bone and ash she had gathered in the autumn, diluted with barrel water and poured at the base of plants that looked thin. Morgan expanded the trench. He added a second bay, a narrower extension branching off the main structure at a 30-degree angle, roofed with heavier timbers and lined with double stone. This bay would be the root cellar, dedicated entirely to food storage. He cut shelves deeper into the north wall, packed them with straw, and designed a ventilation channel that allowed cold air to flow over the stored roots without letting warm air from the main trench escape. He also built a nursery bay, the smallest of the 3 sections, only 12 feet long, with the steepest glass angle and the freshest hotbed. This was where Adeline started seedlings that would later be transplanted into the growing beds or given to the families building their own small pits. In April, Adeline's cough started. It was not like Ellis's cough, not dry and barking, but wet and deep, coming from a place in her chest that she pressed her hand against when she thought no one was watching. Morgan noticed because miners notice coughs. Underground, a cough was information. A dry cough meant bad air. A wet cough meant fluid. A cough that came from deep meant the lungs were working harder than they should, and lungs that worked harder than they should in thin mountain air at 10,000 feet did not improve with wishing. He said nothing for 2 weeks. Adeline said nothing for 3. When he finally asked, she said, "It is old. It started in Denver. The hothouse fires were coal, and coal smoke at night in a closed glass room is not what the lungs prefer. You should see a doctor." "I have seen doctors. They say what doctors say. Rest, lower altitude, warm, clean air." She smiled, and the smile was tired and honest. "I have warm air. It comes through glass and rises from manure. It is not what the doctors meant." She did not stop working. She could not stop working because the seeds needed her, and the people learning from her needed her, and the trench. The whole expanding, breathing, living structure that she and Morgan had built from a dead gulch and a flour sack drawing needed her knowledge more than it needed her strength. But she slowed. By late April, she sat more than she stood. By May, she taught from a chair Morgan built for her from crate wood, placed in the warmest spot in the growing bay where the sun came through the glass at mid-morning and hit the stone wall behind her and the barrel beside her, and the air around her stayed in the low 60s even when the outside air was 40. She died on a Tuesday in late May, sitting in that chair with the seed trays just emerging in the nursery bay and the morning light coming through clean glass onto stone that held the memory of yesterday's warmth. The death was quiet. Morgan had gone to the upper end of the trench to check a drainage seam, and when he came back, Adeline was still in the chair with her head tilted slightly to the side and her hands resting on the seed sack she had been mending. Ellis was the one who knew first. The boy had been sitting near her, sorting panes by size for a new family's cold frame, and he had looked up and seen the stillness, and known what it was because 11-year-old boys who have lost their mothers recognize the specific silence of a body that has stopped. Morgan did not cry. He had not cried at the mine collapse, and he had not cried when his sister died, and he did not cry now. Not because the grief was small, but because grief that large does not exit through the eyes. It sits in the chest like stone and stays there. He covered her with the shawl she had worn every day since October. A heavy wool thing, gray and brown, that smelled of soil and ash and the particular warmth of a greenhouse in early morning. He laid her hands on her lap. He sat beside her for 1 hour. Then he stood and walked to the nursery bay and found the seed packets she had been labeling that week and finished the labels himself, copying her handwriting as closely as his blunt fingers could manage, because she had told him the labels mattered and the labels mattered. Adeline's shawl remained folded over the same barrel where winter sun had first touched the stone wall. Morgan did not move it. It stayed through the summer and into the next autumn, and when people asked about it, he said it belonged where it was. June came to Eagle Fork with 3 weeks of mild weather that made everyone careless, and then the hail came. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon from the northwest, preceded by a sky that turned green-gray in a way that people who had lived in mountain country long enough recognized as the color of damage. The stones were not large, pea-sized, then marble-sized, but they fell dense and fast, and they fell for 27 minutes, and in 27 minutes they destroyed every unprotected seedling in Eagle Fork. Surface gardens were shredded, cabbage starts beaten flat, tomato plants, the few optimistic attempts at altitude growing, stripped to stems, bean sprouts hammered into mud. Three families who had started cold pits but not yet framed them with glass or cloth lost everything they had planted because the pits were open at the top. Morgan heard the hail from inside the trench, where it sounded like 1,000 small fists pounding on the glass above. He ran to the growing bay and watched. The panes shook. Two of the cracked and pitch-sealed panes split further, and cold air whistled through gaps no wider than a coin. But the glass held. The angle shed the worst of the impact. Stones struck at a slant and skidded rather than hitting squares, and the heavy log rafters beneath the sod absorbed the vibration that would have shattered unsupported panes. The trench crops were untouched. Spinach, turnip greens, radishes, onions, the new lettuce starts in the nursery bay, all of them growing in still warm glass-covered air while the sky above hammered the open world flat. Within an hour of the hail stopping, people came to the trench carrying ruined plants. Some were salvageable. Most were not. A woman brought a flat of cabbage starts with every leaf punctured. A man brought bean plants snapped at the soil line. A boy brought 3 tomato stems stripped bare and asked Morgan if they would come back. Morgan looked at the damaged plants and heard Adeline's voice. Not literally. He was not a man given to hearing voices, but the memory of her teaching was so specific, so grounded in action rather than abstraction, that the instructions came to him as clearly as if she were standing beside the barrel in her gray shawl. Trim the broken stems to the lowest healthy node. Remove any leaf that is more than half damaged. The plant will waste energy trying to heal tissue that cannot recover. Move salvageable starts into the nursery bay, where warmth and still air will reduce transplant shock. Do not water for 24 hours. Damaged roots absorb faster than damaged leaves can process, and overwatering a hurt plant drowns it. He ordered people to bring their surviving plants underground. He cleared space in the nursery bay by moving Adeline's mature seedlings to the growing beds ahead of schedule. He trimmed broken stems with a knife Nora had sharpened that morning. He moved nursery trays to the safest beds, the ones nearest the stone wall where temperature held steadiest. Then he used Adeline's staggered planting method to restart the crops that were beyond saving. He pulled seed packets from the tobacco tin, her labels, her handwriting, and planted cabbage, turnip, and bean seed into fresh hotbed soil in the nursery bay. The hotbeds had been replenished in April with new manure Adeline had sourced from the livery, and the decomposition heat was strong enough to germinate seed in 4 days, instead of the usual 7. He did all of this without Adeline. He did it using the knowledge she had built into him over 7 months of daily correction, demonstration, and argument. He did it because she had made him label the seed packets and sort the varieties, and understand the staggered timing, and feel the soil temperature with his bare hand instead of relying on the thermometer. If this story reminds you that the people who teach us live longest in what we do with their lessons, share it with someone who carries that kind of debt. Morgan Pritchard was learning that the trench was never just his. The hail crisis proved something that the winter crisis had only suggested. The trench was not a one-season trick. It was not a desperate measure that worked once under extreme conditions. It was a method, repeatable, teachable, adaptable, that protected food production from the specific threats that made mountain growing brutal. Frost, wind, hail, short seasons, and the wild temperature swings that killed plants before they could mature. 3 families with incomplete cold pits came to Morgan for help. He walked their sites, corrected their angles, showed them where to cut drainage, and told them which crops to start first. He did not charge. He did not barter. He repeated what he had told Greer. Labor first. Rusk watched the traffic to the trench increase. He watched families carry seedlings from Morgan's nursery to their own pits. He watched the seed packets pass from hand to hand. Adeline's saved seed, freely given, the beginning of a supply chain that did not pass through his store. He escalated. Rusk called in old debts. 2 families who owed him for winter flour were told to pay in cash or labor, his labor hauling his wood on his schedule. He tried to force families to buy seed through his store by refusing credit to anyone who accepted Morgan's free distribution. He spread word that the trench-grown produce was inferior, whilst cellar greens, he called them, implying they were pale, tasteless, and potentially unsafe. Nora ended that rumor in a single afternoon. She cooked a pot of soup from trench-grown spinach, turnip, onion, and potato, carried it to the front of Rusk's store, and ladled it out to anyone who walked past. The soup was good. The greens were green. The potatoes were firm. The rumor died with the last bowl. Rusk's monopoly was cracking, and the crack ran along the same fault line that Morgan's trench had exploited in the earth, the line between what people feared and what was actually true. Rusk had built his business on the fear that winter meant dependence on supply trains, on stored goods at marked up prices, on credit extended by the only man in town who had enough inventory to extend it. Morgan's trench did not eliminate that dependence overnight, but it proved that dependence was a choice, not a law of nature, and that proof traveled faster than any rumor Rusk could manufacture. By the end of June, 4 families had functioning cold pits producing early greens. 7 more were digging. Morgan was teaching 3 days a week and working on the trench the other 4. Ellis, who had turned 12 in March and whose cough had not returned since the trench air replaced the open-air sleeping of autumn, carried tools between sites and delivered seed packets with a gravity that made grown men take him seriously. The town that had called Morgan's land a $5 ditch was building ditches of its own. Not all would succeed. Some would flood. Some would sag. Some would be abandoned when the work proved harder than the owners expected. But the method was loose in Eagle Fork now, and methods, unlike men, do not tire and do not quit. Morgan stood in the growing bay on the longest day of the year and felt the sun through the glass on his face. Adeline's shawl lay folded on the barrel. The seed trays were full. The stone wall was warm. He pressed his palm against it, the way his father had once pressed his hand against mine rock, and the heat that came back was not the earth's alone. It was Adeline's. It was the manure, and the glass, and the stove, and the water barrels, and the labor of every person who had cleared snow from the panes at 2 a.m. while the temperature fell and the town slept. It was stored, the way all useful heat is stored, slowly, in mass, against the time when it would be needed again. The second winter came to Eagle Fork the way a test comes to a student who has already passed the first one, with less fear and more preparation, but with the understanding that passing once does not guarantee passing again. Morgan spent the autumn of 1885 expanding the trench system to its full design. The main growing bay now ran the complete 96 feet he had originally sketched on the flour sack, with stone-lined walls, proper clay packing behind every course, and a drainage system that handled 3 straight days of rain without a seep appearing on the floor. The second bay, the root cellar, branched off at the 40-foot mark and extended 18 feet into the north bank, lined with double stone and fitted with shelves deep enough to hold a winter's supply of potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions, and cabbage heads packed in sand and straw. The third bay, Adeline's nursery, as everyone now called it, ran 12 feet along the steepest glass angle, its hotbeds refreshed with new manure in September, and its seed trays already holding the first cold weather starts. The glass had been repaired and supplemented. Greer had arranged a public workday in October, the first time the town trustee had officially organized labor for a private structure, and 12 men spent a Saturday replacing cracked panes, repitching seals, and reinforcing the log rafters that had borne the previous winter's snow load. Morgan directed the work from inside the trench, and Greer, who had commanded freight teams over mountain passes, took orders without complaint. The reversal was visible to everyone present. The man who had told Morgan the math said he would freeze was now carrying timbers at Morgan's instruction. Morgan taught during the workday. Not formally, he did not stand on a barrel and lecture, but in the continuous, specific way that mine foremen teach, by correcting in the moment, by showing rather than explaining, by making a man redo a stone course until the drainage angle was right and then saying, "Now you know. Do not forget it." He showed a miner named Decker how to cut a bank step before setting stone. The step had to angle slightly inward so that water running down the bank face would hit the step and turn outward rather than running behind the stone and undermining the wall. Decker had set stone for mine entries but had never thought about water direction. He rebuilt his step 3 times before Morgan nodded. He showed a carpenter named Strand how to calculate rafter spacing for a sodden snow load at altitude. The math was simple. Morgan used a stick and the dirt floor, but the principle was critical. Every additional foot of span required exponentially more support because wet sod concentrated weight at the center of the span where the rafter was weakest. Strand, who had framed cabins his entire career, looked at the calculation and said, "I have been underbracing every roof I ever built." "Probably," Morgan said. "Cabins shed snow. This does not. The snow sits. You build for the weight that sits." Nora ran the food operation with a discipline that Morgan admired and could not have replicated. She had created a system. Every family that used the trench for storage or growing space contributed labor hours and a percentage of their harvest to a common reserve. The reserve fed anyone in crisis, a family that lost its cabin, a widow without income, a child whose father was injured in the mine. It was not charity. It was insurance. Organized by a woman who had spent 10 years running a boarding house and understood that people would contribute to a system that might save them, but would resent a handout that made them feel small. She kept the books in a ledger she had taken from Rusk's store, purchased, not stolen, at a price she negotiated down to cost by pointing out that Rusk's previous ledger supplier had stopped shipping, and she was the only person in Eagle Fork who could keep accounts that would survive a tax audit. Rusk sold her the ledger at a loss because he recognized in Nora a negotiator whose stubbornness matched his own. The teaching scenes multiplied. Adeline's methods were spreading through Morgan's hands and Nora's organization, but they were also spreading through the people who had learned from Morgan and were now teaching others. Falk, the timber hauler who had been among the first to mock the trench, had built a functional 10-foot cold pit against the bank behind his cabin. His pit was crude. The glass angle was too shallow, and the drainage was marginal, but it produced turnip greens through November and stored potatoes without loss through December. Falk showed his neighbor, a man named Calloway, how to cut the bank step and set stone. Calloway's pit was better than Falk's because Calloway asked Morgan to check it before he set the glass, and Morgan corrected the angle. The Torvald girl, the 14-year-old whose hands Adeline had praised, was starting seedlings in her family's pit and distributing them to 3 other families. She had taken Adeline's staggered planting schedule and adapted it to the slightly different conditions of her south-facing bank, which got an hour more sun than Morgan's Gulch, but had shallower soil and more wind exposure. Her adaptation was good. Morgan told her so, and the look on her face, surprise and pride in equal measure, reminded him of the look Ellis wore when he fitted a stone correctly on the first try. By December of 1885, 15 families in Eagle Fork had some version of a protected growing or storage structure. Not all were trench houses. Most were smaller. Cold pits, banked cold frames, root shelves cut into south-facing clay with glass or oiled cloth covers. But all of them use the same principles: depth for insulation, stone or earth mass for heat retention, south-facing glass for solar collection, drainage to manage water, and venting to prevent overheating on clear days. The second winter tested all of them. December was harsh, not as brutal as January of the previous year, but cold enough that above-ground cabins burned through their wood faster than the supply trains could replace it. 3 of the 15 family pits flooded when a warm spell in early January melted snow faster than their drainage systems could handle. 2 lost their glass to snow load because they had not built roof clearing poles and did not clear in time, but 12 held. 12 families with functioning underground or semi-underground structures came through December and January with stored food intact, greens growing, and heat retained. The contrast with the previous winter, when the entire town had depended on Rusk's store and the Methodist cellar and one trench that nobody believed in, was visible in the faces of people who walked through February without the hollow-eyed calculation of how many days until the next freight wagon. Rusk felt the difference in his ledger. His flour sales in January were down by 1/3 compared to the previous year. His coal sales held. The pits and trenches supplemented heat but did not replace it entirely. But his grip on the town's food supply had loosened in a way that no amount of price manipulation could tighten. People who grew their own turnip greens in January did not buy canned vegetables at 4 times the summer price. People who stored their own potatoes underground did not pay Rusk's markup on potatoes stored in his shed. Rusk's shed was the final demonstration. He had stored his winter potato stock in an above-ground shed behind the store. The same method he had used for years, the method that relied on insulation, straw packing, and the assumption that a well-built wooden structure could keep produce above freezing through a mountain winter. It had worked in mild years. It did not work in the 3rd week of January 1886, when the temperature dropped to 19 below and held there for 4 days. Rusk opened his shed on the 5th morning and found 1/4 of his stock frozen. Not ruined, not all of it, but enough that the potatoes nearest the walls had gone soft and dark where ice crystals had formed inside the flesh and burst the cell walls. He sorted, discarded, and said nothing. But Nora knew. Nora always knew because Nora's boarding house bought potatoes from Rusk every week, and the potatoes she received in the first week of February were smaller than the ones she had been buying, selected from the center of the pile where the cold had not reached. She bought them without comment. Then, on a Saturday morning, she walked into Rusk's store, bought 3 potatoes at his asking price, carried them to the counter, and cut one open with a kitchen knife. The center was brown and wet. Not frozen, the surface had thawed, but the damage was there, a dark ring where the ice had reached, the flesh soft and smelling faintly of the rot that follows a freeze-thaw cycle in starchy tissue. Nora set the cut potato on the counter. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She said, "I would like to return these 3 and select from a different part of the bin." Rusk stared at the potato. 2 other customers were in the store, a woman buying candles and a man pricing harness leather, and both of them stopped what they were doing to look. "The bin is fine," Rusk said. "The bin is not fine," Nora said. "The bin has freeze damage along the north wall. I can see it from here. The potatoes on the left side of the bin are soft. The ones on the right are sound. I would like 3 from the right." Rusk's face went dark, not with shame, Rusk did not shame easily, but with the specific anger of a man who has been caught in a failing system by a woman who understands his system better than he does. He gave her 3 potatoes from the right side of the bin. Nora paid, nodded, and left. That afternoon, Russ came to the trench. Morgan was inside, repairing a hotbed frame where the wood had warped from moisture. He looked up and saw Rusk standing at the top of the log steps, holding 2 pieces of cracked window sash under one arm, his face set in the rigid expression of a man doing something that costs him. "What would you charge to show me the angle?" Rusk said. Morgan set down his mallet. He looked at Rusk for a long moment, at the storekeeper who had doubled his nail prices, who had tried to seize the trench under town authority, who had called in debts to punish families who accepted Morgan's seed, who had spread rumors about cellar greens, who had tried every lever of economic power he possessed to stop the thing that was standing in front of him now, solid and warm and full of green things growing in winter. "Same as everyone," Morgan said. "Labor first." Rusk's jaw worked. He looked at the steps. He looked at the glass. He looked at the stone walls that held heat while his wooden shed surrendered it. He came down the steps. He did not apologize. He did not admit error. He set the cracked sash against the wall and said, "Show me the angle." Morgan showed him. It was not redemption. Rusk did not become a different man. He built a small storage pit behind his store, and he built it competently because he followed Morgan's instructions exactly, and he continued to charge high prices for goods that came in on the train, and he continued to calculate margins with the precision of a man who understood that commerce was the only power that did not require physical strength. But he built the pit. He used the method, and he never again called Dead Gulch a ditch in Morgan's hearing. Nora and Morgan's partnership had been building since the night she brought Clara Bell down the trench steps, and it continued to build the way the trench itself had been built, in daily increments of shared labor, each one small enough to overlook, and all of them together forming something too solid to ignore. She had moved her operations from the boarding house to the trench gradually, first managing rations during the crisis, then staying to organize the food reserve, then taking over the accounts, then teaching cooking methods that use trench-grown produce instead of canned goods. By the spring of 1886, she spent more hours in the trench than in her own rooms. Her boarding house still functioned. She had hired a girl to manage the daily cooking, but her real work was in the Gulch. The moment that marked the shift was not dramatic. Nora arrived one morning carrying a wooden toolbox, her late husband's carpentry tools, which she had kept stored in a trunk since his death. She set the toolbox on the workbench Morgan had built near the living alcove and said, "These should be where they are useful." Morgan looked at the toolbox. He understood what it meant. A widow's husband's tools were not casual objects. They were the last physical evidence of a partnership that had ended, and placing them in a new space was not a statement about the tools. He did not say anything romantic. He was not a man who made romantic statements, and Nora was not a woman who wanted them. What he said was, "Ellis, ask Nora whether she wants her own shelf or whether the toolbox can share with the seed tins." Ellis, who was 12 and observant, looked at Nora. Nora looked at Ellis. Something passed between them that Morgan did not hear, because it was the silent negotiation between a boy who had lost his mother and a woman who had lost her husband, and the terms of that negotiation were not for Morgan to know. "Her own shelf," Ellis said. Morgan cut a new shelf into the north wall the next morning. It was 20 inches deep, 18 inches wide, angled slightly upward at the back for drainage, and faced with the smoothest stone he could find. Nora placed the toolbox on it beside a jar of dried sage from her boarding house garden and a photograph of her husband in a tin frame, and the shelf became hers, and the trench became theirs. They married in the spring of 1886 quietly, with Greer performing the civil ceremony in the growing bay of the trench, because Nora said she wanted to stand where the light came through the glass. Ellis stood beside Morgan and held the deed to Dead Gulch, which Morgan had asked him to hold for reasons he did not explain and did not need to explain. The years that followed compress the way years do when the crisis that defined them has passed, and the work that replaced it is steady and repeating. Morgan and Nora had 2 children, a girl born in 1887 and a boy born in 1889, both of them raised in a household where winter greens were not a luxury, but a discipline, where the temperature of soil at 4 inches depth was a number every child knew, and where the stone walls of the trench held the warmth of accumulated days the way a family holds the warmth of accumulated years. Morgan expanded the trench one final time in 1888, connecting the 3 bays with a covered passage that allowed movement between them without going outside. The full structure, growing bay, root cellar, nursery, living alcove, and connecting passage, covered 140 feet of underground space. It was the largest privately built earth-sheltered structure in Lake County, and Morgan never called it anything but the trench, because the name Adeline had known it by was the name it deserved. Ellis grew. The boy who had coughed through his first autumn in Eagle Fork became a young man who could set stone, brace a rafter, start a hotbed, and read soil color with an eye that Adeline would have recognized and approved. He left Eagle Fork at 17 to work the rail yards in Denver, came back at 20 with a wife, and built his own coal pit against a bank a quarter mile from the Gulch. His pit was better than Morgan's first attempt, because he had watched Morgan's mistakes and learned from them without having to make them himself, which is the specific gift that teaching gives to those patient enough to receive it. Greer died in the winter of 1890 at 67, after writing a set of safety guidelines for covered trenches and earth-sheltered storage structures that the town council adopted without modification. The guidelines specified minimum rafter spacing, drainage requirements, glass angle standards, and ventilation rules. They were practical, precise, and slightly too conservative. Greer had always built for the worst case. But they prevented the 3 most common failures that had plagued the smaller family pits: flooding, roof collapse, and overheating. Morgan attended the funeral and said nothing public. Greer had been the first man to tell him he would freeze, and the first man to admit the trench was a battery. Both statements had been made with the same voice and the same conviction, and Morgan respected the consistency even when it had been pointed against him. Rusk remained in Eagle Fork. He built his storage pit to Morgan's specifications and used it every winter, and he continued to sell flour and coal and nails at prices that reflected his understanding of what the market would bear, and he never became generous or kind or repentant. But he bought seed from the Torvald girl each spring, and he kept his pit's glass clean, and once, when a new family arrived in town and asked where to buy winter supplies, Rusk told them to talk to Pritchard first. Morgan aged the way men who work with stone and earth age, slowly in the face and quickly in the joints. His hands thickened. His shoulders, which had borne the specific compact strength of a mine worker, broadened into the wider frame of a man who dug in open ground and lifted rafters and carried barrels. His limp, acquired during the roof-clearing work of January 1885, when he slipped on ice and twisted his knee against a rafter brace, worsened each winter and eased each summer and never fully left. He kept Adeline's seed labels in the tobacco tin on the shelf beside the nursery bay. Every spring, he opened the tin and sorted the packets and checked the labels against the plants they had produced, and if a variety failed, he noted it in the margin of the label in his own handwriting beside Adeline's, and if a variety thrived, he saved extra seed and wrote the yield on the back. Over the years, the labels became a record, not of one person's knowledge, but of two, layered in different hands, each annotation building on the one before it. He never let anyone call the trench warm because of luck. When visitors came, and they came increasingly from as far as Leadville and Buena Vista, drawn by the reputation of the man who grew greens through winter in a dead gulch, Morgan walked them through the system with the specificity of a man who understood that luck was a word people used when they did not want to learn the method. He showed them the drainage. He showed them the stone packing. He showed them the glass angle, the hotbed layering, the vent system, the water barrels, the stove flue that ran through masonry before exiting. He showed them the thermometer and the charcoal marks on the board where he had recorded temperatures every morning for years. He showed them the method. He did not show them luck, because luck was not in the trench. Labor was in the trench. Knowledge was in the trench. Adaline seeds were in the trench. Morgan Pritchard died on a Thursday in October of 1912, after walking home from an inspection of a neighbor's pit house, where a drainage seam had opened and needed repointing. He was 62. The walk was 3/4 of a mile, and his knee was bad, and the altitude had been harder on his lungs in recent years, and Nora had told him that morning to send Ellis instead. He went himself because the drainage was his work, and the stone was his stone, and the method was the method he and Adeline had built from a dead gulch and a flour sack and a boy's cough and a woman's bones gathered from a dump pile for calcium and potash. He died in the trench. Nora found him sitting in Adeline's chair. The same crate wood chair, rebuilt twice, still placed in the warmest spot in the growing bay, with his hand resting on the stone wall. His palm was flat against it, the way his father had once placed his hand against mine rock in a Welsh drift, feeling for the temperature that told you whether the earth was holding or letting go. By the time Morgan was old, Dead Gulch was no longer an insult. It was a method. 15 families had learned directly from him, and the count beyond them, the neighbors who learned from neighbors, the daughters who carried seed packets to new towns, the sons who dug their first bank steps with tools borrowed from men who had borrowed them from Morgan, was a number no one kept because it was not the kind of number that mattered to people who were busy growing. Morgan lived his later years in Eagle Fork with Nora, Ellis, and the children who grew up thinking winter greens were not remarkable but necessary. He kept Adeline's seed labels in the tobacco tin. He kept the charcoal board with its years of temperature marks. He kept the shawl on the barrel. He never let anyone call the trench warm because of luck. Returned to the auction room, the stove ticking as its iron cooled, the deed curling at one corner on the table, boot mud dried white on the plank floor. Greer's voice, precise and certain, "For $5 you can own the ditch nobody could die poor enough to want." The men in the room laughed. The freight boy grinned. Nora Whitcomb watched from the doorway with flour on her apron and said nothing. Years later, in the same winter wind that blew through Eagle Fork every January, a child carried a pan of green onions down the log steps into the old gulch, where stone walls held the day's heat and glass shone under swept snow. The air below was warm and still and smelled of earth and manure and the faint sweetness of growing things. The child set the pan on the shelf beside a tobacco tin full of seed labels written in 2 different hands. Morgan's hand, old and scarred across the knuckles from 12 years of mine work and 30 years of stone, pressing a child's palm flat against the warm wall, the stone giving back the heat it had taken from the sun. The same gesture his father had made in a Welsh mine drift, a candle guttering in the damp air, a boy's hand on cold rock, learning the only lesson that mattered. The earth does not warm you by kindness. It saves heat only when you stop the wind from stealing it. The town had sold him a ditch. He left them away to keep winter from taking everything.